Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this IT governance webinar on GDPR compliance, information security, and reducing data breach risks. My name is Alan Calder. I'm going to be your host for today. The agenda for today is a brief overview of the GDPR. Many of you will already be aware of it. There are a couple of picks that I want to make in relation to GDPR and data breach reporting. We're going to talk about the relationship between GDPR compliance and an information security management system that's aligned with the international standard ISO IEC 27001. We'll touch on some of the top risks that are causing data breaches in today's world, and in the context of those risks, the benefits of implementing an information security management system, the technical and organizational requirements necessary to demonstrate compliance with GDPR, and of course how you can improve your overall information security in line with the requirements of GDPR. And all of that adds up to how do you reduce the exposure to data breach risks. So a very brief overview of the key issues of GDPR, and I'm talking from the perspective of somebody who's been involved in the world of data protection now for about 20 years. IT governance as a company has existed to provide products and services to organizations dealing with what we'd now broadly call cyber compliance for about 15 years. And we exist to enable organizations to have access to an integrated suite of products and services that enable them to protect organizational assets while complying with a growing range of cyber and data protection related regulations so that they can thrive in today's hyper-connected online, criminally infested marketplace. This is a webinar that will run for about an hour. I'll be talking for about 40 or 45 minutes as I go through the slides. The slides will be made available to those on the webinar later on. If you find that you have questions as we go through the webinar, please do record them in the question line. You'll see a question section in the GoToWebinar panel. If you click on that, you can type in questions, and if you raise questions as you go by typing them in there, when we get to the end of the outbound part of this webinar, what I'll do is that I'll pick up on the questions and I'll go through each of the questions in order, and I'll provide the answer as best I can in the order that you've asked the question. So the General Data Protection Regulation came into effect on the 25th of May. Many of you will have observed the peak in traffic on around that date. It superseded the UK's Data Protection Act 1998 and was incorporated into UK law by means of what's now the UK Data Protection Act 2018. So the Brexit will have no impact on the validity of GDPR in the United Kingdom because it is incorporated in UK law, and the withdrawal, or the expected or planned withdrawal from the European legal framework won't affect GDPR at all. The key thing that GDPR, or the Data Protection Act, does is give individuals more control over how their information is collected and processed. It puts pressure on organizations that process the data of EU residents to tighten up how they protect that data. What it does as a law is it requires organizations, and the scope of the description of organizations is fairly broad. It includes public sector and private sector, it includes not-for-profits, it includes even unincorporated entities. There are circumstances under which it might include individuals who are collecting personal data on anything other than a personal basis only, and requires them to adopt appropriate policies, procedures, and processes to protect the personal data they hold. GDPR is very clear in saying that organizations must take a risk-based approach to determining what the appropriate policies and procedures should be, and should set out to embed data protection in the organization. In other words, to build a workplace culture of data privacy and security. And that's quite a challenge for the United Kingdom, because for some 20 years since the Data Protection Act 1998, data protection has been fairly loose in the UK. Organizations have paid attention mostly in the form of lip service, maybe going so far as to register with the ICO, but because the penalties for non-compliance were very minimal, most organizations, particularly in the private sector, did little to comply with the comply with the Data Protection Act. And of course, that now changes. The reality that organizations face potentially very significant fines for data breaches means that it's no longer possible for organizations to ignore their compliance requirements and to hope that it'll all be okay, and even if they have a breach, nobody will ever find out, because of course GDPR now requires all breaches to be reported, and we'll come back to that shortly. So let me just talk briefly about the link between the GDPR's requirements to take a risk-based approach to the selection of appropriate controls and the role of an ISO IEC 27001 aligned information security management system. An ISMS, which is the acronym for an information security management system, can support GDPR because GDPR, first of all, requires organizations to demonstrate compliance with the 6 data processing principles. If you're familiar with the structure of GDPR, the 5th article sets out 6 data protection principles, which include the requirement that data should be processed fairly, that it should be processed with the consent of the data subject, it should be kept only for as long as necessary for the purposes of the processing, and so on. And one of the principles, the 6th principle, is the data must be protected in line with the purpose for which it was collected. An information security management system is a formal approach to applying information security measures to the protection of data. It's a framework that is designed to help organizations manage, monitor, audit, and continually improve how they do information security. And ISO 27001 evolved originally to operate across the broad range of data that a modern organization deals with. Its scope is data both digital and analog, and it's a standard which is designed to help organizations of all sizes and in all sectors. It's an international standard. It's been around since the early part of the 21st century. It sets out best practice for implementing an information security management system. And because it's best practice and it's recognized as best practice, there's also an attached certification scheme, which means that an organization who has implemented or that has implemented a management system in line with its requirements can seek independent audits and independent certification that demonstrate its compliance with the standard. And given that ISO 27001 is designed to help protect confidential personal information, designed explicitly to help organizations meet their legal and regulatory objectives, and given that on the other hand, GDPR identifies the role of international standards in helping organizations demonstrate compliance, ISO 27001 is the most practical way that an organization can set out putting in place a framework that enables it to demonstrate it's implemented appropriate measures to mitigate the risks to the data of the data subjects that it's collected. An information security management system is a systematic approach to personal data, and it looks at managing security across people, process, and technology. And I'll come back to that, but let me touch first of all on the top risks. And headlines have been full over the course of the last few weeks with significant data breaches. So we've seen the British Airways data breach several weeks ago, in which the personal data of some 380,000 data subjects was exposed over a 2-week period. And this data included payment card data, it included names and addresses, and of course the dates on which people were planning to be away from home. That on its own is of course extremely sensitive, because the criminal underworld being able to buy 380,000 names and addresses and dates by when you're away from home is easy information for criminals planning break-ins. We've seen a major data breach at TV licensing. Stena Britain had a breach. We've seen Equifax have a £500,000 fine levied on it by the Information Commissioner. And that's notable because the breach for which Equifax was fined occurred last year, so the penalties can only be imposed under the terms of the pre-existing regulation, and £500,000 is the maximum fine which could be levied under the Data Protection Act 1998 and its associated legislation. Largest fine levied by the ICO on Equifax. We've also seen a 16.4 million fine levied on Tesco Bank for a data breach in which just a small number of personal bank accounts in the end were compromised. 16.4 million. In this case, the fine was made by the Financial Conduct Authority under the terms of its regulatory powers, but for a data breach. So what we've seen in the last few weeks is a number of very significant breaches and the start of a very different approach to fining organizations for those breaches. When you look at the leading causes of breaches, so from the Verizon Data Breaches Investigations report, 75% of breaches are perpetrated by outsiders. That's probably not surprising. You think of most cyber criminals as being outside the organization, but what's surprising is, of course, that a quarter of the breaches are triggered internally by staff or by contractors. 51% of breaches involved organized criminal groups. Serious and organized crime now has a serious cybercrime capability. It's spending more on developing crimeware than the defensive organizations are spending on developing anti-crimeware capability. We've got nation states involved in crimeware, so the malware which was used to attack British Airways has been used in multiple other attacks and has been traced to the possibility of nation-state, Eastern European nation-state involvement. 18% of attacks, therefore, conducted by state-affiliated actors. So it's a world which is very different from what it was 10 or 15 years ago. The digital world in which there is huge amounts of personal and other valuable data at risk is attacked by organizations who are well equipped and have very great understanding of what it is they're trying to do and have got well developed channels for being able to sell or monetize the data which they steal. 62% of breaches featured hacking. So again, from the Verizon 27 data breach investigations report, what are the vectors of attack? 62% of them involved hacking, outsiders or insiders attacking, taking advantage of vulnerabilities in software to access information, to be able to get hold of privileges which they shouldn't have, to be able to access data which they shouldn't get hold of. 51% involved malware. 81% of hacking-related breaches leverage stolen or weak passwords. And it's interesting, isn't it, that 20-odd years after passwords first became fairly common, and we've been using passwords probably for 40, most people still prefer password or let me in or something simple like that as a password, which of course are very hackable. The top 10 passwords used by most people encompass something like 40% of all passwords used. That means that it's quite easy for hackers. They don't need a very big dictionary to be able to hack most accounts. They just need to be able to deploy the 10 most common passwords. The mistake other organizations make is to have people change their passwords every month, make them have long 14-character, multi-digit alphanumeric passwords, which of course everybody will instantly forget, so they'll write them down, and you'll either have high volumes of help desk calls, or because they're written down, it's even simpler for hackers to get in. So passwords, major challenge. How do you authenticate that someone has the right to access the data? 43% were social engineering attacks, 14% caused by errors and privilege misuse, and 8% featured physical action. So when thinking about protecting against breaches, you're thinking about primarily in the digital world, but not completely. Physical attacks, physical access to a laptop which you're able to get into, or data that you can steal from a filing cabinet, those are still common tactics. So in that kind of environment where breaches are taking place, where you are required to report the breach within a certain period of time, that means that you need to be able to spot that a breach has occurred. Your defensive systems need to be not only as strong as they can, but also resilient. The reality, given that hackers and criminals are spending more on offensive capability than we are on defensive capability, is that you're going to be breached. And therefore, while you do everything you can to protect yourself or defend yourself against a breach, you also need to have defense in depth. You need to be prepared to respond to attacks which get past your first, second, third, and fourth lines of defense. And there's that kind of resilience, which means that you're able to deal with the complexity of today's environment. And if you're going to build defense in depth, you need to have a systematic approach to doing that. You need to be clear that you're tackling the right risks, that you're spending your money effectively. And that's where we go back to ISO IEC 27001. So it's an international standard. It has a number of attributes. The first is that it is designed to deal with data in all its formats, both analog and digital. It recognizes voice data, pictures, JPEGs, any form of information it recognizes being data which is potentially worthy of protection. ISO 27001, for organizations that have certification to it, many of them report, and there is research which evidences that organizations of ISO 27001 are likely to win new business and retain existing customers. And we see a growing number of organizations requiring suppliers in their supply chain to become ISO 27001 certificated, because it's a way in which, as a buyer, you can have some assurance that the organization has taken a systematic approach to dealing with its information security. ISO 27001, if you have an external audit against it and certification, enables you to say to your customers and stakeholders, it's not just us claiming to be secure. We have an independent audit by a competent certification body who's issued a certificate valid for 3 years to say that we are compliant. And that independent assessment of your security posture, of course, is also really useful in dealing with demonstrating to the information commissioner, if you need to, that you've taken all of the appropriate steps you could to protect data. You're not just saying you did, but you went to the point of complying with an international standard and getting certification to demonstrate it. From a supply chain point of view, an ISO 27001 certificate can mean that you don't have to be subjected on a regular basis to customer audits. Large customers will regularly audit compliance across the supply chain. In many instances, if you're able to provide an ISO 27001 certificate with a valid scope and an acceptable statement of applicability, many customers will accept that, and that will reduce your exposure to and cost of meeting supply chain audit requirements. Of course, those attributes mean that you're going to be spending less in the long run on information security. Yes, you've got to make an investment in implementing ISO 27001, in creating the documentation, in training staff, in making sure your controls are effective, but it's an investment which pays off over a long time. It pays off in the form of new business that you win. It pays off in the long-term reduction in incidents, in reputation damage. It helps you respond to evolving security threats, because it's protecting in a very resilient way the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, both personal data and all other forms of valuable data. And because ISO 27001 is a management system, it's going to draw on the whole of the company's organization. So over time, it becomes embedded in the company's culture, its structure, and it becomes part of the key focus areas of management and of people inside the organization. And in doing all of that, it's facilitating compliance with relevant laws and regulations, and particularly in today's GDPR world with the General Data Protection Regulation and the UK's 2018 Data Protection Act. Information security has three pillars or three domains you might think of: people, process, and technology. And just as an illustration, if you think of typical data protection or information security setup, it might involve a firewall. A firewall is a piece of technology. A firewall has to be correctly configured. You need a process that sets out who does the configuration, which ports should be closed, when, how do you audit that? That's a process. And you need somebody who has the appropriate level of skill to be able to configure and maintain the firewall software. So people, process, and technology are three elements of an information security management system, and any organization needs to deal effectively with all of those. What ISO 27001 recognizes is that people and process are in many ways more important but more variable than technology. It's very easy to spend large amounts of technology, large amounts of money on technology which don't generate the level of security which as an organization you should have. But investment in people and process can get your organization to a level of competence around cyber risk that means that without potentially big hardware and software investments, you can operate very securely. I say that because you saw the list of likely attacks: a social engineering attack, a spear phishing or phishing attack. You can have pretty well the best software in the world, but if someone receives an email which they think is designed for them and clicks on a link and there's a payload in the email which downloads, you're done, you're toast. So I got an email today which looked to me like a phishing email. It turns out to have been from a broker, but they haven't got their head around sending out emails that look genuine, that are properly structured. It had an email attachment, so because I'm trained, all of our people are trained, it went directly into our information security team, who spent the next hour testing it before they discovered that actually it's perfectly legitimate. So the other side of training people properly around being able to identify potential risk increasingly will mean training those who are sending legitimate emails and legitimate communications to make sure that what they're sending out is properly structured so that it stands out, it can be recognized as a legitimate communication. So people, training staff, both practitioners, auditors, but also staff generally across the organization need to be aware of what they need to do to protect data. You need to have appropriate professional skills and qualifications inside the organization, and all of that should be supported by the appropriate governance frameworks, accountability for information security, documented procedures for how particular issues should be dealt with. One of those, of course, is incident response. And you should have a documented incident response process so that when someone receives a phishing email, or when a piece of malware is downloaded, or when there is a distributed denial of service attack, the organization knows how to respond to the incident, knows who to escalate it to, knows the timetable, and so that it can be dealt with properly. And part of making sure your information security management system works, of course, depends on regular and ongoing audits. Information security audits are a very important part of ongoing and effective information security. So three domains of information security, and ISO 27001 recognizes all of those. And ISO 27001, in recognizing those domains, is able to tie very neatly into the GDPR requirement that organizations should deploy appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect personal data. Now, the challenge with the requirement that you should deploy appropriate technical and organizational measures is that those terms are not defined in GDPR. Technical is not defined, organizational is not defined, appropriate is not defined, but GDPR says you should deploy them taking account of risks to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. It doesn't tell you how to take account of risks, doesn't tell you what a risk is. So you need a framework that enables you to do that in a way that is demonstratively objective and appropriate. You could make one up yourself. The challenge with making one up yourself is, of course, being able to demonstrate to the Information Commission, and typically this would be after a breach, that what you made up was a sensible and practical framework that met the requirements of GDPR, that it delivers appropriate technical and organizational measures. And that means you get questions around what your own competence is in creating frameworks and yada, yada, yada. So the sensible approach for organizations is to turn, as GDPR encourages you to international standards such as ISO 27001. And ISO 27001 very specifically is a risk-based framework. It very specifically says that organizations should identify the assets they need to protect, identify the risks to those assets, and then determine appropriate organizational and technical controls to protect those risks, and provides a list of 114 such controls from which you can select. International best practice, difficult to do better than international best practice in meeting your obligation to provide appropriate security. So Article 32 of GDPR, which focuses very much around security, talks about measures such as pseudonymization and encryption. As you may well be aware, if data is anonymized, then it falls outside the scope of GDPR. But anonymization means that it's not possible under any circumstances to put the data back together again and identify the data subjects. Pseudonymization is the process, typically automated, of breaking data into 2, 3, 4, 5 different elements, none of which on their own enable you to identify somebody, but when you put them back together again, using perhaps some common code, enable you to identify the data subject. Encryption is a software mechanism that means that data can't be accessed, and typically if data is encrypted both in either in flight or in rest, at rest, and you have a breach, the fact that the data is encrypted means that you can probably argue that the risk to data subjects is low and that you therefore do not need to report the data breach. GDPR says you need to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resilience of the processing systems. And CINA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, are, of course, the 3 attributes of information security around which ISO 27001 is specifically built. So you could almost say that ISO 27001, in its focus on CINA, is absolutely aligned with the requirements of GDPR to ensure the ongoing confidentiality, integrity, and availability. GDPR says that if you have a physical or technical incident, you should be able to restore access to the data in a timely manner. And from a GDPR point of view, having a bank system go out for 3 or 4 or 5 days is a GDPR incident, because people are not able to access the data for the purposes for which they provided it. So I would expect in future that if an organization, if an ATM network goes down for a number of days, that it's reported to the ICO, that it's treated as a data breach, and the organization behind it is, if appropriate, fined in the context of that. So restoring availability and access in the event of a physical or technical incident is part of an appropriate set of measures. And therefore, because data protection is a journey, not a destination, it's about ensuring that data continues to be secure in the changing risk environment. You also need to be doing on a regular basis testing, assessing, and evaluation of the effectiveness of the technical organizational measures which you've put in place, because measures which make your data secure this year will probably be breached next year. Most of the vulnerabilities which exist on websites today and which are known about today also existed a year ago but were not known about. You may not have changed your software. You might say, well, we didn't have a vulnerability a year ago, we don't have one now. The fact is that the ongoing process of probing for vulnerabilities means that a new vulnerability might have been identified. So you need to continually evolve your security mechanisms to make sure that you're able to identify those changes and deal with them. Management systems, and all management systems now, whether they are ISO or ISO, IEC, or British standard management systems, will typically have a number of standard clauses. They'll also be usually numbered in exactly the same way. So clause 4 is typically dealing with the context of the management system, talking about how the management system should be organized, what it can be used for. Clause 5 is typically looking at leadership and setting out requirements for what top management should do, talking about accountability, how the organization should ensure that responsibility is properly delegated, there are named roles through the organization. Clause 6 is looking at planning. And planning will typically include doing a risk assessment for ISO 27001. You can't determine what controls to put in place unless you first of all worked out what assets you've got, and you've determined, having set out a risk scale somewhere on a XY graph looking at likelihood and impact, how to determine what risks might be and therefore what action to take to mitigate that risk. You need to be able to do that. That's part of the planning process, as is the exercise of designing policies and procedures. You need to have proper support, and so clause 7 deals with support. It looks at requirements for staff training and awareness across the organization. It looks at the need for the organization to determine specific competences required of those who have roles within the management system, what practitioner or lead implementer or lead auditor qualifications would be appropriate for someone running the information security management system or leading the ISMS audit capability. It looks at the issues around discipline. It looks at the need for organizations to ensure that where there is a requirement in the policy for people to do things, the ultimate fallback that people can be dismissed or lose their contracts for failing should be made clear. Clause 8 typically deals with the operation of the management system, and from an ISMS point of view, this is looking at the deployment of the decisions that you make around the controls that you've selected. So while it's a fairly short part of the standard, it's the most significant and ongoing part of the actual implementation of an information security management system. And this is the bit which is going to be dealing with all of the controls, physical, environmental, technical, procedural, staff training controls will be covered in this area. So the 114 controls which are listed for reference in the annex to ISO 27001, this is the bit which talks to you about how you would go about implementing those controls. And two important parts of management system are going back to the idea that security is a journey, not a destination, is that your management system should continually improve. It should recognize that however well you've designed it in the first place, it needs to get better. So the combination of evaluating performance across all of the controls, across all of the aspects, and then looking at how you can fine-tune them and improve them over time to get a more cost-effective delivery of information security. All of that is a key part of a management system. So those are the, as I said, common clauses of any management system standard. They are the whole structure of ISO 27001, and of course they tie very much into what GDPR is saying about the need for an organization to have accountability from the top down. And so let me just tie ISO 27001 and what good security looks like to what GDPR is expecting. So GDPR expects board leadership support and commitment. It says in clause 5 that there are 6 data protection principles, but the 7th principle in effect is that an organization should make sure that there is clarity about accountability for the implementation of those standards. And so that's clause 5 of GDPR. Usefully, almost ISO 27001 in clause 5 is talking about leadership and the requirement for top management to be involved in and committed to and leading the implementation of the ISMS. So there's a almost one-for-one correspondence, and also weirdly clause number by clause number correspondence between those requirements. ISO 27001 deals with information security across the whole organization, so does GDPR. GDPR is saying wherever you're processing personal data as the controller, you are accountable for protecting that data. ISO 27001 says that the controls that you put in place should be built around a business-focused risk assessment. GDPR says pretty much the same thing. It says you need to have a risk assessment in order to determine appropriate controls. But the one difference between ISO 27001 GDPR is that ISO 27001 is talking about risks to the organization. It's saying you need to look at what might impact negatively the organization and determine appropriate controls, whereas GDPR is saying don't care about the organization. You need to be looking at what might impact the rights and freedoms of data subjects and put in place appropriate controls. And it's entirely possible that an organization might have different answers to that question depending on whether you're looking at organizational assets or rights and freedoms of natural persons. And it's one of the big shifts between the pre-May 25th environment and today. Before May the 25th, you might have said, I have a database of data subjects. If 25,000 of those records are stolen out of my 25 million, it's a very minor impact. I'm not going to do a lot to protect that. Post May the 25th, of course, it's 25,000 records, and you'd be looking at the risk to the rights and freedoms of those 25,000 people, and actually the risk to them is probably quite high. So the controls you put in place would be very different under GDPR than they might have been under ISO 27001 because of the difference in the assets on which you're focused. 27001 is talking about people, process, and technology risk. As you've seen, that's exactly what ISO 27001 is built around. And the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all data is ISO 27001's preserve. It sees personal data as just one aspect of the data. So whereas from a GDPR point of view, it's only interested in personal data, the implementation of an ISO 27001 management system will go further than you need to under GDPR. It will help you meet your broader organizational and management obligations to protect the organization from obvious risks. ISO 27001 lends itself to regular reviews and continual improvement. GDPR requires an ongoing review and management of your processes for protecting personal data. It can be audited by an external entity, which is part of how it's a requirement under 27001, but it's part of how you can demonstrate to third parties, including the ICO, that you did do the best you could to protect data. ISO 27001 includes provisions for incident response, for logging incidents, for response planning. It follows proven best practice around that. And of course, given that GDPR has a requirement with an automatic up to 2% fine if you fail to meet it, a requirement to report data breaches within a given time frame, the fact that ISO 27001 is giving you a formalized, internationally recognized best practice standard or framework for doing that makes it a particularly useful tool to put in place. So given the correspondence between the requirements of GDPR, which when you fail to meet them can lead to potentially significant fines, and the requirements of ISO 27001, which on its own is an entirely voluntary standard. It's the fastest growing ISO standard in terms of usage across the world right now. We expect it to be more widely used over the next 7 to 10 years than ISO 9001 is now. How do you get started with an information security management system? How do you get started on the business of protecting your organization from the kinds of breaches that might lead you to be facing the same kind of security crisis currently faced by organizations like British Airways? There are 9 steps. I actually wrote a book called 9 Steps to Success on how to implement an information security management system. We've helped some 500 organizations around the world implement ISO 27001 management systems. We've sold thousands of toolkits. We've trained thousands of people on how to do ISO 27001. So this is a really well-informed best practice approach to implementing the management standard. We have a consultancy team which spends large chunks of its time either teaching people, but mostly helping organizations implement a management system that is certified to the standard. And we are so confident of what we're doing that we provide all of our clients with a guarantee that if they don't get certification, we'll do whatever it takes to help them do that. Remembering, of course, that we have no control over the certification process. The client chooses their certification body from an international panel. So the starting point is a project mandate, working out what it is that you want to do, getting the board commitment to what you're going to do, getting senior level commitment to it, determining the goals. What does good overall look like? Set up a project team, ideally drawn from across the business, so you get a proper fertilization. This shouldn't just be an IT-led project, it should be a business-led project, because after all, the benefits are across the business as a whole. So create a project team with the right set of disciplines, the right support. It'll need all of the normal agendas and minutes and those kind of things that help a team operate effectively. Create a RACI matrix, a matrix which identifies for each of the key processes or procedures that you either have or will have, who is responsible, who accountable, who has to be consulted, and who has to be informed. And that's a useful thing, because the reality is that in implementing ISO 27001, there are likely to be a number of changes across the organization, and you'll want to get to the point where you're clear about who is going to be accountable for making sure that particular aspects work. Work out your documentation structure. People, process, and technology are the three domains of cybersecurity, and you need to therefore work out how you're going to document your management system. What's the policy going to look like? How a procedure is going to operate? What's the referencing system going to be? What's your document classification system going to be? How are you going to sign off on documents and say they can be released? All of that is part of creating a documentation structure. It's a very straightforward thing to do, but you need to set out the rules right at the beginning before you start creating documentation. The fourth step is the management framework. The management framework is, how does management turn its desire to have assets properly managed into proper management of assets? So what's the scope of the ISMS? What's the policy going to be? What's the policy's high-level guidance from an ISO 27001 perspective? How are we going to communicate to all of the stakeholders? And what kind of competences do we need in the implementers of this management system? Where are we going to get them from? And of course, allocating a budget is also important. Step 5 is to have a look at the controls you already have in place. And you'll have a number of controls in place, ranging from places where you already have doors and locks, all the way through to firewalls and staff training. So what are your baseline controls, and what are the baseline requirements that you already have in place that you're already meeting? You may already be PCI compliant because you're processing payment card data. You may already have some of the elements of GDPR compliance in place. So you establish the existing requirements for security and the existing controls that you already have in place to meet those requirements. And that enables you to determine where the gaps are. And the gaps will be determined by means of your risk management activity. Your risk management activity, and you'll need a proper process for doing that. You'll need a formal set of steps that enable you to define a risk graph to identify how you're going to determine the likelihood of something happening, the impact on the organization if it does, how you're going to determine what action you should take depending on what the risk actually is, what your risk acceptance criteria is, and out of then carrying out the risk assessment, doing the detail across all of the assets, as well as looking at personal data, you will be able to arrive at a set of controls that's appropriate for you to deploy. And that set of controls in ISO 27001 parlance is called a statement of applicability, a statement setting out which controls from Annex A, the list of controls, is to be applied. Then you're going to set out to implement them. Which controls of the list we've got do we need to deploy, so that you look back at your baseline security criteria, there's a gap, easy to work out what you need to do. And of course, one of the things that you'll need to do is do a training needs analysis. People have such a key role to play in effective information security. You'll want to be determining what additional training you might need to put in place. Measuring, you create your processes for measuring, monitoring, reviewing, and evaluating. Part of that is internal audits. You could use your existing internal audit team. You could subcontract internal audit to organizations like us. You could make it part of the function of one department audit another department. There are a number of ways that you can do that, but the internal audits should all feed into a 6-monthly or annual summary of compliance and a management review. Management can then determine what steps to take to ensure that the management system continues to grow and develop. The 9th step would be certification. would be looking at, and certification auditors look to make sure the documentation meets the requirements of the standard, that you're doing what the standard requires, that you have records of internal audits, of penetration testing, of all of the things that evidence the fact that your information security is operating in line with the risks that you identified and that management is properly evolved. Having achieved certification, it's a 3-year certificate. The certification body returns on a regular basis and audits different bits of your management system, including auditing your auditing, to make sure the management system is continuing to grow and develop. So ISO 27001 fits very well with GDPR's requirement for ongoing and embedding of data protection by default and by design. So I talked about risk assessment. The information security risk assessment is a formal process. It sits at the heart of an ISO 27001 information security management system. It's critical that the risk assessment methodology should be repeatable, transparent, traceable, and consistent. And I can promise you that doesn't mean using a spreadsheet or scribbling it on the back of a fag packet or putting in a Word document. It really means using a structured tool which will take you and anybody else who needs to be able to use it through a very standard, structured approach to risk assessment, which will consistently give you the same outcomes. And also, when there's a breach, will enable you to go back and have a look at how you arrived at the decision about the control, determine what improvements you need to make to the control to avoid the breach happening in future. And with any risk, there are 4 things you can do. You can avoid the risk. You can treat it by deploying a control. You can not take the risk, of course, that's always a practical thing to do, or you can outsource the risk effectively by buying insurance. And insurance, you're really only buying cover against the impact. You can't change the likelihood of it happening, and quite often insurers will want to know you're doing something about the likelihood before they'll cover the impact. So the risk assessment is designed to help you determine what controls to put in place in your ISMS. You shouldn't be deciding to roll out role-based access just because the IT team think you should. You should be rolling it out because it makes business sense. The cost is appropriate to the size of your exposure. All of those are parts of the decision about which controls to roll out. 114 controls in Annex A are arranged in 14 different categories, and you don't have to use those 114 controls. You can use any other set of controls that you want to, but the point about ISO 27001 set of controls is they're well understood, well respected. You could use the NIST 800, SP 800 controls with ISO 27001, but you'd map them to the Annex A controls because that gives you a commonly understood base framework. So the 14 control sets start with information security policies, include the organization of information security, HR security, managing assets. The whole set of controls around access deals with cryptography and encryption, looks at how the IT operation security works, also looks at communications and telecom security, and the existing controls are designed to deal with the world that we live in now, where we have applications and mobile communications, and we have mobile devices, and we have significant endpoint security problems, and we have people working from all around the world. They're not always on the same fixed network. ISO 27001 recognizes all of that. It also recognizes that you have suppliers, and so you need to be able to roll out an information security framework through your whole supply chain. It deals with information security incident management. You remember me saying at the outset of this that the one of the key links between 27001 and GDPR is that 27001 gives you a structured framework for identifying and responding to and reporting information security incidents. It also touches on and enables you to segue into business continuity management, and it's got a set of controls dealing with compliance, both around data protection, but also dealing with other sensitive information, intellectual property, and of course records, the protection of the records themselves. So it's a very comprehensive set of controls, and that's why most organizations will tend to use those controls. As I said a number of times, there are ways in which, as an organization, we can help our clients tackle ISO 27001. You can buy the standard itself. It's published both by ISO, International Standards Organization, and ISO IEC. We're a distributor for IEC, so you can buy the copies of the standard from our websites. You can buy implementation guides. You can go on training courses for both implementing and auditing. The links that you see on the slide here will take you through to those. We have pre-tested, pre-written documentation toolkits, which again have been deployed in thousands of organizations, so they're well tried and tested and are capable of integrating with other management standards as you need them to. We can deploy consultants to help implement in whatever mix you want, a limited number of days, or a team of consultants to help you do the work because you just don't have the resource. And we can support all of that with risk assessment and a growing range of management supporting software. We've tried to pull a number of those things together into what you might call DIY packages, so that you can buy a predetermined package which gives you the mix of products, tools, and services that might be appropriate for your own organization. So all of these links here will take you to where you need to be. The key training courses from an information security point of view are the Foundation, Lead Implementer, and the Combination training courses, and you can do those in the classroom, you can do them online, and you can do them through distance learning. So ISO 27001 then, in summary, an international standard which enables you to get yourself into a position where you can both reduce the likelihood of data breaches, you can develop resilience inside your organization to handle breaches as and when they occur, but above all, which enables you to put yourself in a position where you can demonstrate not only to the Information Commissioner, but also to management, to stakeholders, to customers, that you've taken the most appropriate steps to meet your GDPR obligations to protect the data of your data subjects. We have an ongoing series of webinars, ladies and gentlemen. You can contact one of our ISO 27001 specialists, go on to our website, speak to an ISO 27001 expert, we'll get someone to call you, or you can just call us on 0333 800 7000, email us, a whole bunch of ways that you can get us. And that's what I was planning to say. So, ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I'm here for questions. If you've got questions that you'd like me to answer, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take any questions that you have already put into the GoToWebinar question panel. I'm going to pick them up and I'm going to deal with them in any order. So, as I said, if you have questions, then go to the GoToWebinar panel, type your question in there. If there are any, as I said, I will pick the question up, answer it. For you, the first question is, how does GDPR and or UK DPA 2018 tie into the e-privacy directive, and will ISO 27001 help in its compliance? The e-privacy directive, it depends on exactly which one you're talking about. If you're talking about the current e-privacy directive, which translates into the privacy and electronic communication regulations in the UK, or what is known in a limited way as the current cookies law, but which also deals with email marketing and with other activity, or you might be talking about the forthcoming e-privacy regulation, which is still in development in the EU. If it's the first, well, there are some gaps. GDPR does not repeal the current European e-privacy directive, and so there are some areas in which definitions are not that particularly clear. And that's particularly around the deployment of email marketing and the use of email for marketing. There are some inconsistencies in definitions, but ISO 27001, because it's designed to put you in a place where you are ensuring that you are complying with the law, will help you meet your e-privacy compliance requirements as well. The new e-privacy regulation, though we don't think will be around for another 12 months, it's still undergoing development. It's very closely aligned with GDPR in definitional terms as well as in the penalties regime. Fines will be somewhere between 2 and 4% of turnover, but it will focus very much on the same scope of subjects as does the current e-privacy directive. And so yes, ISO 27000 will help in meeting compliance objections in relation to the e-privacy, either old or new. And ladies and gentlemen, unless you have any other questions, and I would encourage you to ask them now if you do, we're going to be done for the day. So I'd like to thank you all for being on this webinar. I hope you found it useful. If there's any way that we can help you with GDPR, we've got a very substantial GDPR team and competence, or with ISO 27001, please do go onto our website. Please do contact us, and we'll do whatever we can to help you progress on your journey towards demonstrating ongoing GDPR compliance. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye.